It is the 5th of March, 1916, somewhere along a stretch of British trench near Cuinchy, in the flat, waterlogged farmland of northern France. A soldier presses himself against the cold mud of a fire bay, watching a pole rise slowly through the gloom above the parapet. At its tip sits a head. It has hair, a moustache, a cap pulled low over the brow, and a face painted with the dull, weathered color of a man who has spent months in the open. A thin rubber tube runs down through the pole, and from the corner of the mouth, smoke curls upwards into the gray morning air. To anyone watching from no man's land 300 yards off, it is a British officer, careless enough to raise his head for a smoke. It is, in fact, papier-mâché. Somewhere across that scarred stretch of ground, a German marksman is lying utterly still, his rifle resting on a sandbag, a telescopic sight pressed to his eye. For a year now, men like him have owned this section of the front. They do not charge, they do not shout, they barely move, they simply wait, for hours if necessary, for a British soldier to forget himself for half a second, and then they fire once, and they are gone. The British have lost men this way by the dozen, in places where nothing else is happening at all. No barrage, no raid, no attack. Just a single shot from nowhere, and another name for the telegram boy to deliver. So, when the dummy head appears above the parapet that morning, slowly, almost lazily, smoking its cigarette, it is bait. Somewhere behind the British line, an observer presses his eye to a powerful telescope, watching for a muzzle flash while another man crouches with a notebook, ready to mark an angle. The head bobs, it pauses, and then, with a crack that rolls flat across the mud, a bullet punches clean through it. For the men in the British trench, this is not a tragedy. It is a triumph. The head has done exactly what it was built to do, which is to die in place of a living man, and in dying, to betray the position of the rifle that killed it. This is the story of one of the strangest and most quietly effective pieces of equipment to come out of the trenches of the Western Front. A fake head on a stick, built from paper and paste, that helped turn the tables on the German sniper and saved, by one careful estimate, well over 3,000 British and Allied lives. It sounds almost comic, the sort of thing that belongs in a music hall sketch rather than a war, but behind it lay a serious, methodical, and at times desperate, British effort to solve a problem that, for the first 18 months of the war, very nearly had no solution at all. To understand why anyone needed a fake head, you first have to understand just how badly the British Army was losing the sniping war when the conflict began. In August 1914, the German Army went to war with rifles fitted with telescopic sights as standard issue for selected marksmen, optics supplied by firms such as Zeiss that were, quite simply, the best in the world. British industry had nothing comparable ready to hand, and worse, the culture of the British officer corps regarded sniping itself with faint distaste. Picking off an enemy soldier from concealment, without ever exposing yourself to risk, felt to many senior officers like something close to murder, certainly not cricket, and not the sort of thing a gentleman's army did. The Germans had no such reservations. By the time the front froze into static trench warfare in late 1914, German sharpshooters, often former huntsmen and gamekeepers from the Black Forest in the Alps, were exploiting that hesitation mercilessly. The results were stark. It became common for a British battalion to lose around 5 men a day to sniper fire alone, not in any battle, but simply going about the daily business of trench life, fetching water, repairing a parapet, carrying a message. One battalion recorded losing 18 men to snipers in a single day. Across the line, junior officers wrote home describing an atmosphere of constant, grinding dread, the sense that death could arrive at any moment from a source you could never locate and therefore could never answer. A British soldier might serve for months without seeing a single German soldier with his own eyes, and yet lose friend after friend to bullets that seemed to come from nowhere. Morale suffered as much as casualties did. A trench dominated by enemy snipers was, in the words of one officer who lived through it, a thoroughly miserable place to exist, regardless of how the broader battle was going. The existing British response was almost embarrassingly inadequate. A handful of officers had brought private hunting rifles with telescopic sights to France, purchased with their own money or borrowed from friends, but there was no standard equipment, no formal training, and, crucially, no doctrine. The few telescopic sights the Army did possess were frequently so badly calibrated as to be worse than useless, throwing shots wide by feet rather than inches. Soldiers had little understanding of concealment, camouflage, or fieldcraft, the very skills that meant the difference between spotting a hidden marksman and becoming his next victim. Meanwhile, the Germans had identified British observation posts, loopholes, and habitual movements with patient, professional thoroughness, and were exploiting every one of them. By the middle of 1915, in long stretches of the line, the German sniper did not merely have an advantage, he had outright dominance. The man who would change this and who would eventually order the building of fake heads by the thousand was about as unlikely a military reformer as the British Army produced during the entire war. Major Hesketh Vernon Hesketh Pritchard was, before 1914, better known as an explorer, a big game hunter, a first-class cricketer, and a writer of mystery and adventure fiction. He had hunted jaguar in South America and traveled through uncharted stretches of Labrador. When war broke out, the Army initially turned him down for a commission on the grounds that, at 37, he was too old. He found his way to the front anyway, attached to the intelligence department as an officer responsible for war correspondence, which gave him the freedom to move along the line and see, firsthand, exactly how badly the sniping war was going. What he found appalled him, and he resolved, largely on his own initiative and at his own expense, to do something about it. Hesketh Pritchard began by treating the problem the way he would have approached tracking dangerous game, through patient observation, careful testing, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. He borrowed and bought telescopic sights and hunting rifles from contacts back in Britain, calibrating them by hand in makeshift workshops behind the lines. He retrieved samples of German body armor from captured trenches and tested them against various calibers, discovering that British steel plate could be defeated by ordinary German service rounds, while the German armor required a far heavier cartridge to penetrate, knowledge that shaped how British observation posts were subsequently protected. He solicited funding from wealthy contacts and newspaper editors back home, including the editor of The Spectator, to keep the whole improvised program running. Out of this fund came rifles, optical equipment, and, tellingly, dummy heads purchased from Clarkson's, a London theatrical costumier better known for supplying wigs and stage props to the West End than equipment for the Western Front. The dummy head itself was a study in clever simplicity. Built from layers of papier-mâché reinforced with glue or starch over a basic frame, it was light enough to be raised and lowered quickly on a long pole that ran in a groove cut into a wooden board, allowing it to be operated from a safe position below the parapet. The face was painted to mimic flesh tones and shadow with enough conviction to read correctly at 300 yards through a telescopic sight, roughly the distance across a couple of football pitches laid end to end. A cap or steel helmet completed the disguise. In its more elaborate versions, a length of surgical rubber tubing ran down through the neck and pole, allowing a soldier below to blow gently and produce a thin trail of cigarette smoke from the dummy's mouth, the small human detail that made an already convincing decoy almost irresistible to a watching marksman. The tactic depended on a second piece of equipment working in concert with the first. The trench periscope, a simple device of two angled mirrors fixed inside a tube, that allowed an observer to watch the action without exposing so much as the top of his head above the parapet. As the dummy rose into view, bobbing with the unhurried carelessness of a genuine soldier enjoying a quiet smoke, observers in two or more separate positions would train their periscopes and telescopes on the German line, waiting. The moment a shot struck the head, the entry and exit holes in the soft papier-mâché preserved the bullet's exact trajectory, like a frozen snapshot of the shot's flight path. Spotters in different locations could then triangulate those angles, drawing imaginary lines back from the dummy through the holes towards their probable point of origin, narrowing the German sniper's position down to a specific section of trench, a particular loophole, sometimes a single tree or shell hole that had been camouflaged as an observation post. Once located, the position could be marked on a map and dealt with by a counter-sniper, a Lewis machine gun team, or simply called into the artillery, who would saturate the spot with shell fire. This single innovation, however ingenious, was only part of a wider and more systematic British effort that Hesketh Pritchard drove forward over the course of 1915 and 1916. He developed an armored double loophole for observation posts, consisting of a fixed steel plate at the front and a second plate mounted in a sliding metal shutter at the rear, so that the two would only align, exposing a clear line of fire on roughly a 1 in 20 chance at any given moment, making it dramatically harder for a German sniper to put a bullet through a British loophole than the reverse. He pushed relentlessly for standardized, properly calibrated telescopic sights to be issued across the Army rather than relying on whatever individual officers happened to own. And in August 1916, with his reputation now firmly established, he founded the first Army School of Sniping, Observation and Scouting in the small village of Lingham in the Pas-de-Calais, a facility that began with a single class of just 6 students and rapidly grew into an institution training soldiers from across the British and Allied forces at a rate, Hesketh Pritchard claimed with evident pride, 3 times faster than any comparable school then operating anywhere in the world. The dummy heads themselves were deployed all along the British sector of the Western Front, though the records of exactly when and where remain frustratingly patchy, scattered through regimental diaries, training memoirs, and the recollections of men like Hesketh Pritchard rather than any centralized account. What is documented, largely through his own writing and that of contemporaries, is a clear pattern of use. Dummies raised at irregular intervals to avoid establishing a predictable rhythm a German sniper might learn to anticipate, employed in close coordination with observers positioned at carefully separated angles so that triangulation would actually work, and often used specifically in sectors where a particular enemy marksman had become troublesome enough that his exact position needed pinning down before he could be eliminated. Accounts describe German snipers shooting clean through the dummy's head and neck, the bullet's path through the soft material giving away not just a rough direction, but, in skilled hands, a remarkably precise bearing back towards the shooter's hide. The psychological effect on German marksmen, once they grasped what was happening, can only be inferred rather than proven from the surviving record, though it stands to reason that a sniper who has just revealed his own position by firing at a fake, only to be answered by an artillery barrage moments later, would have thought rather harder before taking his next shot. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing at all. Germany, for its part, never developed anything resembling an equivalent counter-sniping program of comparable scale or sophistication during this period of the war. The German Army's advantage at the outset rested on superior optics and a head start in training individual marksmen, not on any broader doctrine of deception or counter-detection, and there is a little evidence the German military command saw a pressing need to match British innovations of this kind while they still held the upper hand. French forces, fighting their own desperate sniping war along the line, developed dummy head decoys independently and at roughly the same time, suggesting the idea emerged as a fairly natural response to a shared problem rather than spreading directly from one army to another, though British and French units in adjoining sectors certainly exchanged tactics and equipment as the war progressed. American forces, arriving in France from 1917 onwards with comparatively little frontline sniping experience of their own, drew heavily on British training methods and the curriculum established at schools like the one at Lingham, adopting both the practical lessons and, in some units, the dummy heads themselves. What distinguished the British effort was less the originality of the basic idea, which was a fairly intuitive piece of trickery once you think about it, and more the rigor with which Hesketh Pritchard and his colleagues built it into a complete, repeatable system: dummy plus periscope, plus triangulation, plus a trained counter-sniper waiting to finish the job. The measurable impact of this wider program, of which the dummy head was one small but emblematic part, was significant enough that contemporaries felt confident putting a number on it. A friend and fellow marksman, George Gray, calculated that Hesketh Pritchard's reforms had reduced sniping casualties from around 5 men per battalion per week down to just 44 across 60 battalions over a 3-month period, a reduction that, by his estimate, equated to more than 3,500 Allied lives saved. It is worth being honest about the limits of that figure. It comes from a single contemporary calculation rather than a rigorously audited statistical study, and the precise contribution of the dummy heads themselves, as distinct from improved sights, better training, and the armored loopholes, is impossible to isolate with confidence from this distance. What can be said with more certainty is that British accounts from the later years of the war describe a complete reversal of the sniping balance on the Western Front, from a situation in which German marksmen dominated no man's land almost unchallenged, to one in which British snipers and their supporting observers had, in the words of General Lord Horne writing in the foreword to Hesketh Pritchard's own post-war account, outplayed the Germans at this particular game by the time the guns fell silent in November 1918. The broader legacy of the dummy head and the doctrine built around it outlasted the war itself by decades. Sniper schools established in Britain in the years that followed drew directly on Hesketh Pritchard's curriculum, and the basic principle, use a convincing decoy to provoke a shot, then use the evidence of that shot to locate the shooter, has resurfaced again and again in conflicts since, refined but never fundamentally replaced. Versions of papier-mâché or fabric dummy heads, sometimes mounted on simple tripods rather than poles, were used again in various theaters during the Second World War, where British training establishments revived and adapted the underlying technique for a new generation of soldiers. Remarkably, the same basic trick has been observed as recently as the war in Ukraine, where soldiers near Bakhmut were photographed using mannequins to draw sniper fire, while a colleague watched through a trench periscope, a scene that would have looked entirely familiar to a soldier serving under Hesketh Pritchard in 1916. Few pieces of First World War equipment can claim a more direct, traceable line forward into 21st century combat. Original examples of the dummy heads themselves are vanishingly rare, most having been destroyed in the very act of doing their job, though illustrations survive in Hesketh Pritchard's own post-war writing, and reproductions can occasionally be found in military museums devoted to the trench warfare of the Western Front. Return for a moment to that morning near Cuinchy, to the pole rising slowly above the parapet and the painted face catching the gray light. It is easy, looking back across more than a century, to see something almost absurd in it. A war fought in part with paper and paste, with a fake man smoking a fake cigarette while real men crouched in the mud below, waiting to see who would die in his place. But there is nothing absurd in what that small, strange device actually achieved. It took a problem that had seemed, for the better part of 2 years, to have no solution at all, a problem that was killing British soldiers by the dozen every single week without a shot being fired in anger by anyone they could see or fight back against, and it turned that problem inside out. It made the enemy's greatest advantage, his patience, his concealment, his willingness to wait motionless for hours for a single, clean shot, into the very thing that betrayed him. Every dummy head raised above a British trench was a small, deliberate lie, and every German bullet that struck one was the truth coming out. What began as an improvised piece of theatrical trickery, bought from a London costumier, and built from the kind of paper and glue any child might recognize from school, became one strand in a wider transformation that saved, by the best estimate available, well over 3,000 lives. It did not win the war. No single device ever does. But it took back, inch by careful inch, a kind of ground that no army had managed to take back from German snipers in the first 18 months of the conflict. The simple, vital sense that a man could raise his head above a parapet without it being the last thing he ever did. A papier-mâché head, smoking a cigarette it could never taste, helped restore that. And in a war fought largely with steel, gas, and unimaginable quantities of high explosive, it is worth remembering that one of its strangest and most effective weapons was made, quite literally, of paper.